Yo, what's up Serpa Squad? Tanner here, and in this one, I'll show you how I made a live planted bioactive vivarium for Whodini, my 14-year-old blotched kingsnake. That includes how I made the background, water bowl, and many other components. I'll talk about how I built the plywood tank in a different video, but without any further delay, let's get to work. The first thing to address is the background. I use 1.5 inch thick polystyrene insulation foam. At $15 for a 4x8 foot piece, it's a very inexpensive option for a build of this size. I measured the interior of the tank and transferred those measurements to the foam. I cut the pieces out accordingly. I put them in place and sketched a basic idea of what I wanted to carve. This is just an idea, but it gives me a good place to start from. To add the details, I'll use clay carving tools. I like using these because they create a nice rocky texture with minimal effort and mess. As I was working, I found it difficult to do it in the tank, so I took them out and continued carving. To keep the mess at a minimum, I vacuumed throughout the process. It took a while to get it carved out, but I was fairly pleased with the result. I did a quick pass with the heat gun. This tightens the foam, makes it stronger, and brings out the rocky texture. I also cut a section out of the front of the side pieces to account for ventilation. I'll paint the foam to look like stone with Drvlok. I have the original white, which I'll color with Quikrete tints. For the first layer, I mixed up some black. This will give me a good base to work with and bring out the highlights. Something nice about this paint is that it dries hard and has a gritty texture to it. For this tank, it will make a great surface for Dean to rub against while in shed. Anyway, I went on to cover everything with paint. The first layer is the most important one, so I made sure to get it down into all of the cracks and crevices. After it was left to dry, I added the second layer, which is a medium gray. I used a dry brush technique. I applied a little bit of paint to the brush and lightly applied it to the raised areas. This really brings out the texture by creating the highlights. These layers dry really quickly, so I was able to apply the third layer shortly after. This time, I'm using an even lighter gray. It's essentially the base Drvlok with a few drops of tint. Once the paint dried, I could secure the panels to the tank. I used white silicone because that's what I had on hand. I applied a decent amount to the back piece and put it in place. To ensure it stayed against the tank, I used other pieces of foam to prop it up. I let it cure for around 12 hours. Then I went on to add the side panels. Again, I applied the silicone and pressed them in place. Here you can also get a look at the side ventilation I mentioned earlier. This could work as is, but the corners aren't seamless. To address it, I'll use expanding foam. I applied it along the entire seam between the panels. After it cured, I went back and carved it like before to match the rest of the background. Once that was good, I went and painted it accordingly. Prior to setting up the tank, I thoroughly rinsed off the background. This will get rid of anything loose or excess that may have built up in the process. Live planted snake enclosures come with a few challenges. In my case, Whodini is very active and likes to burrow at times. Because of this, he will dig up plants and move them around. You may have success letting the tank grow for years prior to adding the snake, but I don't have that kind of time. I think I was on the right track with the previous setup I did, but it wasn't perfect. I modified that idea, and I think I've come up with something that will work really well. I have these aquatic net baskets that I cut down to a smaller size. They're just a little too tall as is. From there, I put down hot glue and lined the baskets with geotextile fabric. This will keep all of the substrate in place without restricting the plant's roots to the confines of the basket. I filled the bottom of the planters with pebbles. This will weigh down the baskets and create a small false bottom of sorts. I filled them up with a blend of substrate that's different from what I'll use in the rest of the setup. I'll list the components on screen. I also used zip ties to secure window screen over the top. What I've created is a standalone plant basket that's tamper-proof and able to be placed anywhere in the tank. To add the plants is simple. I cut slits in the screen and situated them accordingly. Once I got them in place, I went back and zip tied the slit shut. Here's how they look now. Dean won't be able to dig up the plants, but until they thoroughly root in, he may be able to knock them over if he really tries. I don't think it will be much of an issue though. Also, I'll show you what plants I used and why later on. As for the rest of the setup, I'll mix up a substrate blend that's similar to what he'd naturally encounter. It's a 2 to 2 to 1 mix of cocoa fiber, organic topsoil, and play sand. Yo, Play Sand Tanner checking in again to make sure that you liked the video and subscribed if you haven't done so already. This mix will encourage burrowing behaviors and should actually hold up after he leaves. In theory, he can return to burrows he's made previously without having to dig them all over again. Anyway, I had issues mixing it all up in the bucket, so I moved it over to the tank to complete the process. Since the plants are isolated and this isn't a very humid setup, a false bottom won't be needed. As the plants need water, I'll just target the baskets. In addition to that, there are components in the baskets that retain water, which will keep runoff at a minimum. The substrate layer is also pretty deep. Anyway, I added a base layer to the tank to get an idea of how it will look. I lightly packed it down to help keep his burrows as I described earlier. Everything looked right, which meant it was time to escape the tank. The first element I'll add is Dean's cork bark perch. He likes to bask on top of it, hide in it, and use it for shedding. I placed this in the same location as the previous tank because I think it worked really well for him in that spot. It also will help give him a sense of familiarity. I worked in the first plant basket. I put it near the cork bark to help soften the edge. I want it to look like a tree fell on top of plants and now they're growing around it. I also added another plant on the left side. I continued adding items including driftwood and cork bark pieces. I sourced off the driftwood locally many years ago. Unfortunately, I don't know specifically what kind it is. They were in his previous tank though, and he made good use of them. I continued to add pieces of cork, branches, and the remaining plants throughout until I got something I could work with. I also added some slate near the hotspot to collect heat for Dean to rest on. Now I can make the water bowl. I glued two pieces of foam together and cut them out into a bean-like shape. First I carved the exterior to match the background. Then I carved the inside of the bowl. Here's what I ended up with. It looks like your standard water bowl. I went back and painted it like before with Drvlok. The only difference was that I sealed the inside with Pond Shield epoxy. I did this to ensure it will hold water and to strengthen the piece. I added 3 layers total. Once it cured, I thoroughly rinsed the bowl. I did a water test off camera and it held water perfectly. I like how it turned out other than the cloudiness in the bottom. I applied a little too much epoxy on the first layer, otherwise this wouldn't have happened. It's only a minor issue though and not worth redoing at the moment. The reason I even did this was to match the background and to make a bowl large enough for Dean. Anyway, I dug out a spot in the enclosure and fitted in accordingly. I'll have to pull it out and redo that portion of the setup every time I need to clean it, which will be annoying, but it's one of those trade-offs I have to make for a better aesthetic. Admittedly, it also gives me an excuse to socialize with Dean. He's extremely inquisitive and always wants to know what I'm doing when I'm in or near his home. After it was in place, I worked in the remaining elements. Let's top it off with the leaf litter. These are leaves that I gathered from my yard in the fall. Before use, I boiled them to ensure they're free of pathogens or anything like that. Per usual, they'll create a home for the cleanup crew and fertilize the plants long term. They'll also add spots of increased humidity and give Dean something else to interact with. I also added damp sphagnum moss under the cork pieces on the right to create humid pockets. Given the nature of this setup, I know it will be nearly impossible to keep moss alive. It just won't be humid enough. I really want that look though, so I decided to incorporate some dried mosses. I put them throughout the floor of the enclosure and in crevices on the background. The last design element I included were a few additional vines of Pothos. I planted these ones directly into the substrate. I don't know how they'll do, but I figured I should give it a try. Worst case, they don't thrive, and I have to wait for the main plant to establish itself. We're pretty much done here. I'll briefly go over the equipment, and then we'll get it stocked. First is a 100 watt ceramic heat emitter. I have this hooked up to a thermostat to regulate the temperature. The thermostat is installed in the canopy. From there, the probes run down the front of the enclosure and are secured with stainless steel staples. The rest is hidden under the substrate and the probes are placed inconspicuously. I also have a Reptisun 5.0 UVB right above Dean's cork perch. This is essentially the same way it was mounted in his previous tank and he made good use of it. Long term, I may switch over to a longer light to cover more area. Lastly, I have some LED strip lights for the plants and for ideal viewing of the tank. Let's get it stocked. We'll start with the Springtails. As you know, these will help break down organics and keep mold at bay. My guess is they'll primarily congregate near areas of moisture, which is where they're needed most anyway. Next are the isopods. I have a variety here and will list them on screen. I think most of them will do quite well. These will clean up any waste I miss while spot cleaning. Just because I'm adding a cleanup crew, that doesn't mean it's time to get lazy. Cleaning up after Dean is still a very important task given the amount of waste he produces. Last but not least, we'll add the man himself. There you have it, my take on a bioactive Kingsnake enclosure. I had to go through several iterations of this to get something I think will work long term. The most troublesome elements being the plants. As I said, if I had time to wait, this would be less of an issue. Even still, he'd probably end up digging through the roots and uproot everything. I think what I came up with is a great solution because it addresses that problem while still allowing the roots to go through the setup. The geotextile fabric is permeable and the roots can easily grow through it. Otherwise, we wouldn't get all of the benefits of the plants and it wouldn't truly be bioactive. It will take a few months before we get to that point though. Of course, the cleanup crew plays a role in that as well. Those, combined with beneficial bacteria and fungi that will form in time, will create a pretty natural setup. It will no doubt take some fine tuning in all departments to get it fully dialed in, but all things considered, I think it's a great setup for my Kingsnake. That said, don't take this as a definitive setup guide. and doing what I found works for my snake. Do your own research and fine-tune your design based on your animal's habits. I've observed and interacted with Dean for almost half of my life, so I have a decent idea of what he will and won't use, and even now I'm still learning more. I already know that some of you are thinking this isn't a good scape. My response to that is that you have to realize what I'm dealing with here. As soon as you're making a setup for a large animal, the game changes. You have to consider what will hold up long term and what it will actually be able to use. For me at least, I think this is a good combination of utility and aesthetics. In line with that, all of the plants I chose are robust and easy to care for in variable conditions. By the way, the tank itself is a custom built plywood enclosure that measures 72 inches long, 24 inches deep, and 28 inches tall, which is 210 gallons or 794 liters. On that note, I think I've said enough. I had a lot of fun with this build and I'm so excited to finally have this portion of the animal room done. It's the start of bigger and better things that I cannot wait to share. Stay tuned for that. Until next time, Serpa Squad, take care and peace.